Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about responsible uses of artificial intelligence, which is certainly a topic that deserves a lot more attention as AI's impact on business and all of human life is expanding so dramatically. To discuss that, I'm joined by Scott Zoldi, Chief Analytics Officer at FICO. Scott, thanks for joining us today.
James, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
I've got some interesting questions I want to ask you about, but I think, first of all, your title is at least worth noting in that, you are the Chief Analytics Officer, the CAO. I know, of course, we got CTOs, CIOs, but you're the Chief Analytics Officer. I'm not sure what my question is. I just find it very timely that you are the CAO.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's an important role. I think it evolved from like this concept of a chief research officer to one that really is focused on sort of analytic algorithms and strategies and where the market is moving from an AI and machine learning perspective. Because to your point, when you opened up the podcast, it's just a really important topic to stay on top of, and it's evolving continuously. So such the role.
All right, well, let's talk about responsible uses of artificial intelligence. I must admit that sometimes I'm a little pessimistic in that there's a lot of potential there in AI and certainly a lot of investment. I'm not sure that it's always going to be used totally responsibly. I'd like to get your sense, as you survey the business market, what is your sense of the awareness that companies have of the importance of responsible uses of AI?
So, I think with things like GDPR and the EU regulation and the AI Bill of Rights and other guidances and best practices that have been put out, I think most companies and analytic teams are aware of the importance of responsible AI and the fact that they're consumers of AI, and the customers impacted are asking questions of whether or not it's responsible or not. So I think there's this broad awareness. Interesting enough, though, despite all this sort of regulation and guidance, right, how companies go about really addressing that, beyond good intentions is probably the larger problem. And so in terms of the importance of this, like we've done a survey of like 100 different financial services companies, and it's like 71% in that survey said that it's not a core part of their strategy today, addressing responsible AI. So I think there's an awareness that we need to address. I think there's a lot of work to be done to practically address that concept.
Well, all right, let's step back a little bit and define what is responsible AI and what does it look like in real world action?
Yeah, so responsible AI, there's a number of different definitions. For me, there's four major components. So one is this concept of what we call robust AI, and then explainable AI, ethical AI, and finally auditable AI. And I'll just take them in turn, right? Robust AI is this sort of concept that we need to build models carefully and thoughtfully and take the time to build them well. And what does that mean? That means that we work with, correctly interrogate our data. We build with algorithms that we understand deeply and we know how they behave, right? We don't go and spin up a model in a half a day up in a cloud somewhere and deploy it in production and impact customers. We spend a lot of time understanding the behavior of that model and the impact to customers. And too often that's skipped, right? And that could be, months if it's going to be a customer impacting model to do all that work to ensure you understand that and it's built robustly and safely. Explainable AI, right, is what it is. It's can you explain what drove the outcome? And this is very, very hard for many organizations today. Machine learning technologies are not very good at demonstrating kind of what drove that decision. And when you're given an outcome that you don't understand and you want an explanation around that, then you really need to dive into what are the technologies you're using. And too often many companies are using algorithms on top of algorithms to try to get at a meaning, whereas other companies such as FICO invest a lot of our energy in things like interpretable AI, which are models that are built from the ground up to be more understandable and interpretable. The third one,
if I can interrupt on that one, I find this really, it's a pretty much of a hot button issue, the idea of explainability. Correct me if I'm wrong. So there's explainability in terms of granting loans, financial institutions granting loans, and someone wants to know why was I turned down for the loan? And sometimes that is it's an algorithm, and the algorithm suddenly has to explain itself, or the people who run it. This is why you're turned down for the loan. I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on explainability, AI being explainability in the years ahead for that reason.
Absolutely, absolutely the case, and it's actually even more complicated than that because, as you mentioned, right, you have the model that made it, comes up with a risk assessment. You have a strategy that's applied. Then you have the individual sort of person that's making the decision, and so how you track that through that entire AI chain is complicated, and it's one of our research topics actually. As things get, as we look at it as an AI software. Coming back to those two other ones, right? Ethical AI. Really front and center. Many of us are aware of these AI algorithms that do really odd and sometimes unethical things when they're not built very carefully. And so, from the ground up, how to build and choose algorithms that you can kind of test for ethics and ensure that they are behaving ethically is a big part of responsible AI. And the final one is auditable, and that's just ensuring that how that model gets developed is following a model development standard. And you can show proof of work. So, like if I have 100 scientists in the office today with me, right, I can't have 100 different ways that they build models. And so, having a standard that's followed, ensuring that it's followed correctly and it's defined centrally for an organization is a big part of responsible AI, because you need to understand what are the processes that the company gets behind to ensure that it's following the practices of building things safely and responsibly, ethically, and in a way that can be explained.
Well, it seems like one of the challenges with an algorithm being auditable is that algorithm or model or a machine learning model was built by one or two or several team members, probably data scientists, developers. It may not, perhaps those aren't the people who should be auditing it. Maybe the problem is someone in management doesn't really have the technical expertise to be auditing that. Are those concerns real? How do the non-tech folks audit what's going on, driven by the tech folks?
It's an excellent question, James. Yeah, so it's one where and it'll get even kind of worse, right? This very often when it's time to audit that model, the scientists are no longer with the organization, so there's no one to talk to, right? And so part of that model development standard is simply to say, okay, for our organization, we're only going to use this one technology, and we are going to expose, let's say, the latent features that drive that outcome, and we will show as part of the model development process that they've been tested for ethics, and we'll show the relative importance. And so the concept really is to have an agreement across the entire business of what that audit would look like, so that those pieces of work are done as part of the model development process. So when the model is released, you have all of that kind of codified so that the business owners will be able to go through and look at what are those latent features. We would be able to understand whether or not they've met the regulatory requirements there. And then if the business changes down the road, and let's say the data drifts or the business environment drifts, you can go look at, what could that impact in the model and whether you would want to do some analysis around it. Moreover, like at FICO, we take it pretty seriously. We actually put it on the blockchain because we also want this sort of concept of an immutable sort of audit chain, so that you can't go in and change the data down the road, right? There are successes and mistakes made in every day when you build machine learning models. And so what we try to do is make sure that we codify that along the way. And so if a data scientist, failed to test, we're going to acknowledge that in the blockchain, right? We're going to address it and fix it and have that as part of the source of record. But, that standard is really important because it addresses all the stakeholders' needs, not just the data scientists who think they understand the model, but the business owners and the management teams that have to have confidence in it from a responsible AI perspective too.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Also, so FICO uses blockchain. It makes perfect sense. It's funny when I read a lot of things, talk to a lot of experts. Sometimes people throw shade at blockchain, like, oh, it's more hype. But I think it's fascinating. So FICO is definitely a believer and has implemented the blockchain.
We have, and in fact, it's a patent that I've applied for and was already been granted. This concept of an immutable blockchain for recording this proof of work of how we develop models is just really core and important to us because, and there's a few things that happen, frankly, right? One thing that happens is when you sign the blockchain, let's say you're a data scientist on my team, James, and you say, I've done this test, and you'll sign off on it and I'll review it. And now we have two names attached to the blockchain. It's there for the rest of the time, right? And so people start to take things very seriously. It's the same way as if I asked you to sign a piece of paper. And so it drives that level of accountability. But the fact that we have that history is really important because you can imagine a company like FICO that has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of models. We need an ability to go back in time, like you said, right? And understand how that model was developed and have all those assets at our fingertips
Mhm.
when there's a crisis, right? Like the COVID situation, and we want to understand how models will behave through that. Excuse me, that blockchain is really that tool. We don't want to go back to emails or figure out whether the data scientist, we can get a hold of him or her to ask the questions, because they're not going to remember either, right? That's why we have to codify it to the chain.
Right. Well, let's look at FICO itself. Interesting organization. What's the most significant about the work you're doing in terms of AI and database decision making? What's cool and interesting?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch, but I think one of the things that I think is really interesting is a concept that I like to call corpus AI, and it's essentially this sort of broader recognition of the impact that a model has on the overall decision process. So kind of like you mentioned before, right? You have the data that comes in, and the quality of the data impacts the decision, and you have the types of models that you develop. But then you have the rules and the strategies, and then you have the people that are actioning those, and then you have eventually outcome information. So there's a lot of pieces to that. And even chasing down kind of what impacts that final decision can be really difficult, right? Because maybe the score is used very heavily, or maybe the score is used less heavily for a decision. And so how do you correctly attribute the explanation to the customer? So this concept of the fact that, as a data scientist, you have to be aware that entire sort of software value chain in the AI decision is one of those areas where we're building the sort of connective tissues, if you will. Right? I use this analogy of a body of those different components, so that we can kind of do the correct attribution to, okay, what was it in that entire chain of different sort of technology that caused a positive or negative sort of result that we want to be able to explain in terms of, let's say, an outcome. And so that's one area. It's just kind of.
Can I clarify that? I think I understand what you mean, but let me just make sure I do understand. So it sounds like the corpus AI is a tracking and monitoring system for the model creation, or am I wrong about that?
But for the entire AI decisioning system. So,
Gotcha.
we transcend one layer up. And so, for example, like in the old days, right, a model might produce a score and reason codes. And if you ask what was the reason for the decision, someone might give you a model reason code. But that's not really the correct reason code or the correct sort of explanation, because there's lots of other pieces to it. So it's looking at that entire sort of software AI, not just model. And too often we get fixated on the machine learning models, right? Because they're interesting things, but
Sure.
not the entire software process around it.
All right. So I think the big question, the question that people are thinking about across the industry, is the future of AI in business and decision making. And I would point out, maybe it's a related footnote, that looked like yesterday a company made an offer for OpenAI and valued them at $29 billion. Or that the Chat GPT AI deployment, everyone's fascinated by that. We're thinking, where's it going to go in the future? What is your take? If you look into your own crystal ball, what are some key milestones we can expect in the years ahead in terms of AI and business decision making?
Yeah, no, great question. And so, I think, when I look at what's happening in our space today in AI, it's fascinating, right? But I also look at, coming back to the very beginning of our conversation, the regulation, the responsibility of the consumer, right? How complicated even simple models are, very, very complicated to explain and have a tremendous faith in. And so I think there's two major things I would call out. One, I think there's going to be this sort of focus on practical AI, which basically means, listen, we're building a model not to impress our friends, right? We're building a model to solve a business problem. So what is the simplest, most transparent, interpretable algorithm that we can use that we safely understand? And we're going to put kind of explainability first, and we're going to put ethics first and prediction second. So this sort of concept of these very hyper complicated machine learning models that people can't understand and won't understand, it's probably not in our future from a business perspective if we're going to comply with regulation, and we're going to make sure that we're responsible. And so there'll be this concept of practical AI, which essentially will come down to, I think, technologies that are essentially a 95% or 98% solution, but they tick off things that are more important in the business world, which are around treating customers fairly and correctly and ethics. So that's one, right? So we'll see probably a little bit of retrenching of sort of the whiz bang, that's cool, to, hey, we're impacting human life here, and we need to do this responsibly. The other one is this concept of the corpus AI. I think the one other thing that becomes more clear to me, right, is like, in that same survey I mentioned, only 8% have a modeling process, right? Of those 100 different financial services companies with their CAO or CIO titles. Right. So it's complicated, right? And so we may start to see kind of a consolidation of a few key players that will provide these concepts of AI platforms that will kind of have all the responsible AI sort of software frameworks that are required, and will have the proper monitoring in place that will extract things like latent features. And so I think we may see the same sort of trend that we've seen in cloud computing, where there might be 3 or 4 or 10, whatever the number is, really core platforms that businesses will start to use, because it's simply really difficult to do these things really well and to meet that responsible AI contract with your clients. And so that may be another trend that we'll see in the business world, which, if it means more responsible and safer decisions for consumers, it's great, right? But I think those will be 2 sort of things that I'll be looking for in the future, because I think just given the complexity and to your earlier point around, concern about being responsible, making sure that we have the right platforms that invest the time and energy to provide that for those that build models for their customers or for the businesses, I think will start to become a very high priority for businesses as they focus on what they should be, which is solving their business problems, not necessarily, being in AI competitions, let's say.
Well, I think you certainly must be right about the platform issue, in that companies aren't going to be able to build that platform in-house, or if they try to, it's going to be prohibitively expensive and they're going to run into all sorts of headaches. So the idea of the outsourced AI platform, I think it's inarguable that's going to be happening. And I see what you mean. It could be 3 to 5 or 10. We don't know how many. There's going to be those leading platforms. Of course, the hyperscalers are already doing that, and there's other companies as well. I don't know what my question is, but I think it's interesting. There is going to be the race to be one of those 3 to 5, 10 platforms. And maybe that's the answer to how we really regulate and hold AI responsible, and that it's only really mostly done by these 10 or so platforms. We really can sort of monitor the limited number of platforms.
Correct, right? And if we set ourselves in the regulator's shoes, right? I mean, they provide guidance, but yeah, if there's 1,000 different ways of solving problems, right? It's to make sure it's done well, they might have to prescribe a few different methodologies, that this is the method for how we explain, and this is the method for how we show it's responsible, and this are the thresholds where it is and where it isn't. And I think that's where it's going to go. And it doesn't mean that data scientists like myself won't be able to innovate, right? We will bring technologies into those platforms, but you're absolutely correct. It's just the scale of sort of sophistication of ensuring that we can comply and build, right, will mean that we'll probably bring technology or IP to those platforms and leverage a large portion of those platforms, while still, having the creativity that we enjoy today as data scientists, and we need to continue to innovate.
Scott, I think you said it. It's going to be a fascinating sector to follow in the years ahead. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, and come back and talk with us again sometime.
I'd love to, James. Thank you so much.